The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of delayed flights and frustrated travelers. Gate 42B had become a gathering point for complaints, with passengers checking their phones every few minutes and shooting annoyed glances at the departure board. Flight 847 to San Diego had been delayed 3 times already, and tempers were starting to fray in the cramped waiting area. Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn military jacket and tried to find a quiet corner where she could rest her aching leg. The prosthetic had been bothering her more than usual today, probably because of the long layover in Chicago. She had been traveling for nearly 18 hours, making her way back from a veterans hospital in Boston where she had been receiving treatment for complications from her injuries sustained during her deployment in Afghanistan. At 28, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from years of military service, but today she felt every bit as tired as she looked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face showed the strain of constant travel and medical appointments. The purple heart pin on her jacket caught the fluorescent light occasionally, but most people were too busy with their own problems to notice. The gate area was packed with business travelers, families with crying children, and college students heading back to school. Sarah found an empty seat near the window and settled in carefully, trying not to draw attention to the way she favored her left leg. She had learned over the past 2 years that people reacted differently when they noticed her disability. Some offered unwanted pity, others stared with curiosity, and a few seemed to look right through her as if she were invisible. As she pulled out her phone to check for messages from her sister, Sarah overheard a conversation from the seats behind her. 2 men in expensive suits were complaining loudly about the delay, their voices carrying over the general noise of the terminal. "This is ridiculous," one of them said, his voice dripping with entitlement. "I have a meeting in San Diego that's worth more than most people make in a year. They need to get this flight moving or find us another one." His companion nodded in agreement, equally frustrated. "I don't understand why they can't just bump some of these other passengers. Look around this place. Half these people probably bought the cheapest tickets available. We're paying for business class." Sarah tried to ignore their complaints, focusing instead on a text message from her younger sister Maria. The message was full of excitement about Sarah's upcoming visit and plans for the weekend. Maria had been Sarah's anchor during the darkest days of her recovery, visiting her in the hospital and helping her adjust to life after her injury. The announcement came over the intercom with the crackling static that seemed to plague every airport in America. "Attention passengers on Flight 847 to San Diego. Due to mechanical issues, we're going to need to delay the flight for an additional 2 hours while our maintenance team completes their inspection. We apologize for any inconvenience." The collective groan from the passengers was immediate and loud. Sarah watched as people began pulling out their phones to rearrange plans, call hotels, or vent their frustration to anyone who would listen. The 2 businessmen behind her were among the loudest complainers, their voices rising above the general murmur of discontent. "2 more hours," the first man exclaimed. "This is completely unacceptable. I'm going to talk to someone in charge." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and marched toward the gate counter where a young airline employee was already being bombarded with questions and complaints from other passengers. Sarah could see the stress on the young woman's face as she tried to maintain her professional composure while dealing with increasingly angry travelers. Sarah had seen this kind of behavior before, both in the military and in civilian life. Some people handled stress and disappointment with grace, while others seemed to think that making noise and demanding special treatment would somehow change the laws of physics or mechanical reality. She had learned patience during her years of service, and even more during her long recovery process. The businessman reached the counter and began speaking in a voice loud enough for most of the gate area to hear. "This delay is completely unacceptable. I need to be in San Diego tonight for an important business meeting. What are you going to do to fix this situation?" The gate agent, whose name tag read Jennifer, took a deep breath before responding. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but safety is our top priority. Our maintenance team needs to complete their inspection before we can clear the aircraft for departure. I can help you look into alternative flights or provide information about hotel accommodations if you need to stay overnight." "Alternative flights," the man's voice rose another notch. "Do you see how busy this airport is? There aren't any alternative flights. And I shouldn't have to pay for a hotel because of your airline's incompetence. Sarah noticed other passengers beginning to stare at the scene unfolding at the gate counter. Some looked sympathetic to the businessman's frustration, while others seemed annoyed by his aggressive approach. The second businessman had joined his colleague at the counter, and together they were creating quite a scene. Jennifer maintained her professionalism, but Sarah could see the strain beginning to show. I can offer you meal vouchers for the delay, and we can certainly look into rebooking options. Let me check what's available. Meal vouchers, the second businessman laughed sarcastically. Do you know how much money we're losing every hour we sit in this terminal? Meal vouchers don't even begin to cover the cost of this delay. As the argument continued, Sarah found herself thinking about her own journey and the delays she had experienced. Unlike these businessmen, she wasn't traveling for money or career advancement. She was simply trying to get home to her family after months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. The delays were inconvenient, but they were just another obstacle to overcome, like so many others she had faced in recent years. A family with young children had been sitting near the gate counter, and the rising voices were starting to upset the smaller children. Sarah watched as the mother tried to comfort her crying toddler while the father gathered their scattered toys and snacks. The confrontation at the counter was affecting everyone in the area, creating an atmosphere of tension and discomfort. The businessman was still berating the gate agent when an elderly man in a wheelchair approached the counter. He had been sitting quietly near the window, and Sarah had noticed him earlier because of his Vietnam War veteran cap. The old man waited patiently for a break in the argument before speaking. Excuse me, he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Young lady, don't let these fellows upset you. You're doing your job, and you're doing it well. Sometimes flights get delayed. That's just the way it is. The businessman turned toward the elderly veteran with an expression of annoyance. This doesn't concern you, old man. We're trying to resolve a serious business matter here. The veteran's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm and measured. Actually, son, it concerns everyone here. We're all in the same situation, and making that young lady's job harder isn't going to get any of us to San Diego any faster. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the elderly veteran. She had always admired the way older military personnel carried themselves with dignity and stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. It reminded her of her own commanding officers, who had taught her about honor, duty, and treating others with respect. The businessman's face was turning red with anger, but before he could respond, another passenger joined the conversation. This was a middle-aged woman who had been traveling with her teenage daughter. He's absolutely right, she said, looking directly at the businessman. We're all frustrated about the delay, but there's no reason to take it out on someone who's just doing her job. The gate agent didn't break the airplane. More passengers began to gather around the counter, not to complain about the delay, but to show support for the gate agent and the elderly veteran. Sarah watched this development with interest, seeing how a single act of moral courage could inspire others to stand up for what was right. The first businessman looked around at the growing crowd of passengers who were clearly not on his side. His aggressive posture began to deflate slightly as he realized that his approach was not winning him any allies. The second businessman tugged on his colleague's sleeve, apparently suggesting they return to their seats. This is ridiculous, the first man muttered, but his voice had lost much of its earlier volume and authority. We're just trying to get to an important meeting. Jennifer, the gate agent, smiled gratefully at the passengers who had come to her defense. I really appreciate everyone's patience and understanding. I know this delay is frustrating for everyone, and I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to keep you updated and help with any rebooking needs. The crowd began to disperse, with passengers returning to their seats or wandering off to find coffee and snacks during the extended wait. The two businessmen reluctantly walked back toward their seats, their earlier bravado significantly diminished by the experience. Sarah remained in her seat, but she felt a warm sense of satisfaction at seeing ordinary people stand up for someone who was just trying to do her job under difficult circumstances. It reminded her of the camaraderie she had experienced in the military, where people looked out for each other and stood together in the face of challenges. The elderly veteran wheeled his chair over to where Sarah was sitting and nodded toward her purple heart pin. Army?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "Served 2 tours in Afghanistan." "Good for you, young lady. I can see you've got the right attitude about these kinds of situations. Some folks never learn that getting angry doesn't solve problems." They talked quietly for a few minutes about military service and the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. Sarah found comfort in speaking with someone who understood the unique experiences of military personnel. The veteran's name was Frank, and he had served in Vietnam during some of the most difficult years of that conflict. "You heading home?" Frank asked. "Yes, sir. Been at a VA hospital in Boston for some treatment. My sister lives in San Diego, and I'm going to spend some time with her family." Frank nodded approvingly. "Family's important. That's what we fought for, really. The chance for people to be with the ones they love and live their lives in peace." As they talked, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere around the gate had improved considerably. Passengers were still frustrated about the delay, but the earlier tension and hostility had dissipated. Children were playing games with their parents, business travelers were working on laptops or making phone calls, and people were generally treating each other with courtesy and respect. The 2 businessmen had settled into seats across the gate area, and, while they were still clearly unhappy about the situation, they had stopped making a scene. Occasionally, one of them would glance over at Sarah and Frank, perhaps wondering about the conversation between the young woman and the elderly veteran. About an hour into the extended delay, Jennifer made another announcement. "Attention passengers on Flight 847. I have a positive update for you. Our maintenance team has completed their inspection ahead of schedule, and we should be able to begin boarding in approximately 30 minutes. Thank you again for your patience." This announcement was met with applause and cheers from the waiting passengers. Sarah smiled at the collective relief in the room and began gathering her few possessions in preparation for boarding. The delay had been frustrating, but it had also provided an interesting glimpse into human nature and the way people responded to stress and inconvenience. Frank reached over and shook her hand. "It was a pleasure talking with you, young lady. Thank you for your service, and I hope you have a wonderful visit with your family." "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to meet you." As the boarding process began, Sarah noticed that the gate area had taken on a much more positive atmosphere. Passengers were helping each other with luggage, families were organizing their children, and even the 2 businessmen seemed to have calmed down considerably. Sometimes it just took one person standing up for what was right to change the entire dynamic of a situation. Sarah gathered her small bag and prepared to board the plane, looking forward to seeing her sister and spending time away from hospitals and medical appointments. She had no idea that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn that would remind her of the bonds that connected all those who had served their country in uniform. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, and passengers began forming lines according to their assigned zones. Sarah checked her boarding pass and realized she would be in one of the later groups, which was fine with her. She was in no hurry, and the extra time gave her a chance to rest her leg and observe the organized chaos of airline boarding procedures. As she waited for her zone to be called, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few hours and the unexpected kindness she had witnessed from strangers who chose to stand up for what was right. It gave her hope that despite all the challenges facing the world, there were still good people who believed in treating others with dignity and respect. The boarding process moved more smoothly than Sarah had expected, with passengers filing onto the aircraft in an orderly fashion. She found her assigned seat in row 23, an aisle seat that would give her extra room for her prosthetic leg. The plane was filling up quickly, and Sarah could see that it would be completely full for the flight to San Diego. As she settled into her seat and stowed her small bag in the overhead compartment, Sarah noticed the 2 businessmen from the gate area taking their seats in the business class section near the front of the plane. They seemed to have regained some of their earlier confidence now that they were finally boarding, and she could hear one of them talking loudly on his phone about rescheduling his meeting. The middle seat next to Sarah remained empty as the boarding process continued, and she found herself hoping it would stay that way. The flight was long enough that having extra space would make the journey more comfortable, especially given the ongoing issues with her prosthetic. The aisle seat gave her room to stretch her leg, but more space would certainly be welcome. Her hopes were dashed when a large man in his 50s squeezed down the aisle carrying a bulky carry-on bag and checking seat numbers. He stopped at her row and looked at his boarding pass with the expression of someone who wasn't particularly happy about his seat assignment. "Looks like I'm in the middle," he said with a slight grunt as he lifted his bag toward the overhead compartment. "This is going to be a long flight." Sarah helped him with his bag, using her good leg to stand and guide the heavy case into the compartment. The man introduced himself as Bob, and explained that he was traveling to San Diego for his daughter's wedding. Despite his initial grumpiness about the seating arrangement, he seemed friendly enough once he got settled. "You military?" Bob asked, noticing Sarah's jacket and the purple heart pin. "Former military," Sarah replied. "Army. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan." Bob's expression changed immediately, becoming more respectful and interested. "My oldest son is in the Navy. He's stationed in Norfolk right now, working on destroyers. I worry about him, but I'm proud of what he's doing." They talked quietly as the plane filled up around them. Bob told her about his son's naval career and his daughter's upcoming wedding, while Sarah shared some general stories about her military service. She was always careful not to discuss the details of her injury or the circumstances that led to her medical discharge, but she enjoyed talking with people who understood and respected military service. The window seat in their row was taken by a young college student who introduced herself as Emma. She was heading back to UC San Diego after winter break and seemed nervous about flying. Sarah and Bob both tried to help her feel more comfortable, offering tips about dealing with turbulence and explaining what the various sounds and movements of the aircraft meant during different phases of flight. As the plane prepared for departure, Sarah noticed increased activity in the business class section. The flight attendants seemed to be having an extended conversation with someone in the front rows, and there was more movement and discussion than usual for a routine departure. She couldn't see what was happening from her seat, but the flight attendants appeared to be showing unusual deference to one particular passenger. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-flight announcements about weather, flight time, and arrival information. The flight to San Diego would take approximately 4.5 hours, with clear skies expected for most of the journey. Sarah settled back in her seat and tried to get comfortable for the long flight ahead. Takeoff proceeded smoothly, and soon they were climbing through the clouds over Chicago. Sarah always enjoyed the takeoff phase of flying, feeling the powerful thrust of the engines and watching the ground fall away below. It reminded her of her transport flights during her military service, though those had been in much different aircraft under very different circumstances. About an hour into the flight, after the beverage service had been completed, Sarah noticed some commotion in the front of the plane. Passengers were standing up and looking toward the business class section, and she could hear excited whispers and conversation. Bob craned his neck to try to see what was happening, but their seats were too far back to get a clear view. "Something's going on up there," Bob observed. "Looks like someone important is on this flight." Emma, who had been trying to study, put down her textbook and joined them in trying to figure out what was causing the excitement. "Maybe it's a movie star or something," she suggested. "I heard that celebrities sometimes fly commercial when they want to avoid attention." The speculation continued among the passengers, with various theories being whispered up and down the aisles. Some thought it might be a politician, others suggested a sports figure, and a few passengers were convinced it had to be someone from Hollywood. The flight attendants seemed to be managing the situation professionally, but there was definitely an undercurrent of excitement throughout the cabin. Sarah was less interested in celebrity spotting than her fellow passengers. Her experience in the military had taught her that truly important people often looked quite ordinary and preferred to avoid attention. She had served alongside officers who had distinguished themselves in combat but who looked like regular soldiers unless you knew their history and accomplishments. The excitement in the front of the plane continued for several minutes before gradually settling down as passengers returned to their seats and activities. Bob continued to crane his neck occasionally, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was causing the stir, but eventually gave up and returned to reading his magazine. About 2 hours into the flight, Sarah got up to use the restroom and stretch her legs. The prosthetic had been bothering her more than usual during the flight, and she needed to move around to prevent additional discomfort. As she made her way up the aisle, she passed through the business class section and caught a glimpse of the passenger who had been attracting attention. He was a man in his early 40s, wearing a simple navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants. Nothing about his appearance screamed celebrity or important figure, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested military bearing. His posture was perfectly straight, his hair was cut in a precise style, and his eyes had the alert, observant quality that Sarah recognized from her own service and that of her fellow soldiers. Their eyes met briefly as she passed his seat, and Sarah felt a flash of recognition, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. He nodded politely, and she returned the gesture before continuing toward the restroom. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. When she returned to her seat, Bob was eager to hear her observations from her trip to the front of the plane. "Did you see who everyone was so excited about?" he asked. "Just a guy in a polo shirt," Sarah replied. Nothing particularly remarkable about him, though he definitely looked military. Military? Bob's interest was piqued. Maybe he's a general or an admiral or something. That would explain why everyone was so interested. Sarah considered this possibility as she settled back into her seat. High-ranking military officers did sometimes attract attention when they traveled in civilian clothes, especially if other passengers recognized them from news coverage or public appearances. But something about the man's relatively young age and low-key appearance suggested he might be someone else entirely. The flight continued smoothly, with the usual mix of passengers reading, sleeping, working on laptops, or watching movies on their personal devices. Sarah tried to rest, but her leg was becoming increasingly uncomfortable despite her efforts to find better positions. The narrow airplane seats weren't designed for people with prosthetics, and long flights were always a challenge. Emma, the college student, had struck up a conversation with Bob about his son's naval service, and Bob was enthusiastically sharing stories about his son's training and assignments. Sarah listened with half attention while trying to manage her discomfort and think about the upcoming visit with her sister's family. About 3 hours into the flight, the captain announced that they were beginning their descent towards San Diego and would be landing in approximately 45 minutes. Sarah felt relief that the journey was almost over and looked forward to getting off the plane and moving around normally again. As they descended through the clouds, San Diego spread out below them in the afternoon sunlight. The city looked beautiful from the air, with its harbor, beaches, and distinctive skyline clearly visible. Sarah had always loved this view of the city, and it reminded her of why she was looking forward to spending time with her sister's family. The landing was smooth, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Sarah noticed that the man from business class remained seated while other passengers stood up and retrieved items from the overhead compartments. This was often a sign that someone was being given priority treatment or special handling by the airline staff. Bob helped Sarah with her bag from the overhead compartment, and they joined the line of passengers waiting to exit the aircraft. Emma gathered her textbooks and backpack, chattering excitedly about getting back to campus and seeing her friends after the winter break. As they moved slowly toward the front of the plane, Sarah could see that several passengers in business class were still seated, apparently waiting for something or someone. The flight attendants seemed to be coordinating with ground personnel, and there was definitely more activity than usual for a routine arrival. When they reached the business class section, Sarah got a better look at the man who had attracted so much attention during the flight. He was sitting calmly, apparently in no hurry to leave the aircraft. His carry-on bag was a simple black case, and he was holding what appeared to be official military travel orders in his hand. As Sarah passed his seat, she caught another glimpse of his face and, suddenly, realized why he looked familiar. She had seen his photograph in military publications and news articles, though she couldn't immediately recall the specific context. He was definitely someone important in military circles, but she still couldn't place exactly who he was or why she recognized him. The line of passengers continued moving toward the exit, and soon Sarah found herself stepping off the plane and into the San Diego airport terminal. The warm California air was a welcome change from the recycled atmosphere of the aircraft, and she felt her spirits lift as she realized she was finally at her destination. Bob and Emma said their goodbyes as they headed toward baggage claim and their respective destinations. Bob was being picked up by his daughter's family, while Emma was taking a shuttle back to the university campus. Sarah wished them both well and headed toward the main terminal to meet her sister. As she walked through the jetway, Sarah could hear increased activity behind her. Flight attendants and ground personnel were having animated conversations, and there seemed to be some kind of special protocol being followed for the remaining passengers on the aircraft. She was curious about what was happening but focused on finding her sister and getting to her family's home. The terminal was busy with the usual mix of arriving and departing passengers, families reuniting, and business travelers hurrying to their next flights. Sarah scanned the crowd looking for her sister Maria, who had promised to meet her at the gate. After several minutes of searching, she spotted Maria's familiar face near the windows overlooking the tarmac. Maria Martinez Thompson rushed over and enveloped Sarah in a warm hug, being careful not to put pressure on her injured leg. The sisters had always been close, but their bond had grown even stronger during Sarah's recovery and rehabilitation process. "I'm so glad you're finally here," Maria said, stepping back to look at her sister. "How was the trip?" "I heard there were delays in Chicago." Sarah briefly explained the delays and the drama at the gate, though she didn't mention the mysterious passenger who had attracted attention during the flight. She was more interested in hearing about her nephews and Maria's husband, and in getting to their house where she could rest and relax after the long journey. As they walked toward the baggage claim area, Sarah noticed continued activity around the gate where she had just arrived. Security personnel and what appeared to be military officers in civilian clothes were gathered near the jetway, and passengers were taking pictures with their phones of whatever was happening. "Something interesting going on over there," Maria observed, following Sarah's gaze toward the commotion. "Probably just some VIP arriving," Sarah replied. "There was someone on my flight who seemed to be getting special treatment." They continued toward baggage claim, with Maria chattering about plans for Sarah's visit and updates on her family's activities. Sarah was grateful to be focused on family matters rather than the mysteries and complications of air travel. She was looking forward to spending time with her nephews and simply enjoying the peaceful routine of normal family life. The baggage claim area was crowded with passengers from several recent arrivals, and Sarah settled in to wait for her single suitcase to appear on the carousel. Maria continued talking about weekend plans and the special dinner she had prepared for Sarah's first night in San Diego. As they waited, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The long road of recovery from her injuries, the months of medical treatment, and the ongoing process of adjusting to life as a disabled veteran had all led to this moment of simple family reunion. She felt grateful for her sister's love and support, and looked forward to a few days of peace and normalcy away from hospitals and medical appointments. Sarah's suitcase finally appeared on the baggage carousel after what felt like an unusually long wait. Maria helped her navigate through the crowded baggage claim area, and soon they were heading toward the exit and Maria's car in the parking garage. The California sunshine felt wonderful on Sarah's face after the long day of travel, and she could smell the ocean breeze that made San Diego such a pleasant place to visit. Maria's house was located in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes from the airport. During the drive, Maria filled Sarah in on all the family news, including updates on her two sons, ages 8 and 11, who were both excited about their aunt's visit. Sarah's brother-in-law, David, was a high school teacher and coach, and he had planned to adjust his schedule so he could spend more time with Sarah during her stay. "The boys have been asking about you every day since we knew you were coming," Maria said as they pulled into the driveway of a modest two-story house with a well-maintained yard. "They want to hear all your army stories, though I told them they need to let you rest and not pester you with too many questions." Sarah smiled at the thought of spending time with her nephews. During her recovery, their innocent questions and boundless energy had provided a welcome distraction from the challenges of learning to live with her disability. Children had a way of seeing past physical limitations and focusing on what really mattered in relationships. The next few days passed in a blur of family activities and quiet relaxation. Sarah helped her nephews with homework, played video games with them, and told carefully edited stories about her military service that emphasized teamwork and problem-solving rather than combat and danger. David proved to be an excellent host, making sure Sarah was comfortable and had everything she needed while respecting her privacy and independence. On Thursday morning, Maria suggested they take a trip to Balboa Park, one of San Diego's most beautiful attractions. The park housed numerous museums, gardens, and cultural institutions, and Maria thought it would be a perfect way to spend the day outdoors without requiring too much walking or physical exertion for Sarah. They packed a picnic lunch and headed to the park early in the morning to avoid crowds and find good parking. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-70s. Sarah felt more relaxed and comfortable than she had in months, surrounded by family and enjoying the simple pleasure of a beautiful day in a beautiful place. The park was already bustling with activity when they arrived. Families were setting up picnics, joggers were making their way along the various trails, and tourists were consulting maps and guidebooks to plan their visits to the different attractions. Sarah, Maria, and the boys found a perfect spot near one of the smaller gardens where they could eat lunch and watch the world go by. After lunch, they decided to visit the San Diego Air and Space Museum, which the boys had been eager to see. Sarah was interested in the military aircraft exhibits, while Maria hoped the interactive displays would keep her sons engaged and educational. The museum was moderately crowded, with a good mix of families, school groups, and military enthusiasts examining the various aircraft and space exploration exhibits. As they made their way through the museum, Sarah found herself drawn to the section devoted to military aviation history. The displays included aircraft from different eras and conflicts, along with detailed explanations of their roles in American military operations. She was particularly interested in the helicopters and transport aircraft, which reminded her of her own experiences in Afghanistan. The boys were fascinated by a flight simulator that allowed visitors to experience what it felt like to pilot different types of aircraft. While they waited in line for their turn, Sarah noticed a small crowd gathering around one of the main exhibits featuring a Navy helicopter that had seen service in recent Middle Eastern operations. A museum docent was giving an informal presentation about the aircraft's capabilities and mission history, and the crowd seemed particularly engaged with his explanations. Sarah moved closer to listen, partly out of professional interest and partly because the docent seemed to know quite a lot about military aviation operations. As she approached the group, Sarah realized that the docent wasn't actually a museum employee. He was a visitor like everyone else, but he was clearly someone with extensive knowledge and experience with military aircraft. He was a man in his early 40s wearing casual civilian clothes, and something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. The man was explaining the helicopter's role in special operations missions, describing how these aircraft were used to insert and extract military teams in dangerous situations. His knowledge was detailed and precise, suggesting first-hand experience rather than just academic study. Other visitors were asking questions about specific missions and operations, and he was answering with the kind of insider knowledge that came from actual participation in such activities. Sarah listened to the impromptu presentation with growing interest. The man's explanations brought back memories of her own experiences with military aviation in Afghanistan, including the helicopter flights that had taken her to forward operating bases and remote locations where her engineering unit had worked on infrastructure projects. As the informal presentation continued, Sarah began to feel more confident that she recognized the speaker from somewhere. His voice, his mannerisms, and his obvious expertise all seemed familiar, but she still couldn't place the specific context where she might have encountered him before. She was certain it wasn't from her own military service, as their paths had never crossed during her deployments. The crowd around the helicopter exhibit was growing larger as word spread that someone knowledgeable was giving an impromptu talk about military aviation. Families with children, veterans, and other museum visitors gathered to listen and ask questions. The atmosphere was relaxed and educational, with the speaker encouraging questions and sharing information in a way that was accessible to people with varying levels of military knowledge. Sarah found herself drawn into the presentation, asking a few questions about the specific modifications made to helicopters used in special operations. The speaker answered her questions with obvious respect for her own military background, which he seemed to recognize from her informed questions and professional terminology. "You sound like you have some experience with military aviation yourself," the man observed after Sarah asked a particularly detailed question about helicopter maintenance requirements in desert environments. "I served in Afghanistan," Sarah replied simply. "Army Corps of Engineers. We worked with aviation units on various construction and infrastructure projects." The man nodded approvingly. "Important work. Infrastructure and logistics are often the unsung heroes of military operations. Without good engineers, the rest of us couldn't do our jobs effectively. Their conversation was interrupted when Maria appeared with the boys, who had finished their time with the flight simulator and were ready to explore other parts of the museum. Sarah excused herself from the group around the helicopter exhibit and rejoined her family, though she continued to think about the knowledgeable stranger and why he seemed so familiar. As they moved through other sections of the museum, Sarah occasionally caught glimpses of the man from the helicopter exhibit. He seemed to be genuinely interested in the various displays and was often engaged in conversations with other visitors, sharing his knowledge and answering questions with the same enthusiasm he had shown earlier. The boys were particularly excited by the space exploration exhibits, which featured artifacts and displays related to NASA missions and the history of American spaceflight. They spent nearly an hour exploring the interactive displays and watching videos about different space missions. Sarah found herself thinking about the dedication and sacrifice required for space exploration, drawing parallels to her own military service and the commitment required to serve something larger than oneself. As they prepared to leave the museum, Sarah's family stopped at the gift shop to look for souvenirs and educational materials related to their visit. The boys were excited about model aircraft kits, while Maria was interested in books about aviation history. Sarah browsed through the military-themed items, looking for something small to commemorate her visit. While they were shopping, Sarah noticed the man from the helicopter exhibit entering the gift shop with what appeared to be his own family, a woman and 2 teenage children. They seemed like a typical family enjoying a day at the museum, and Sarah was struck by how normal and ordinary they appeared despite the man's obvious expertise and knowledge about military operations. As Sarah's family finished their shopping and prepared to leave the museum, she found herself walking near the other family toward the exit. The two groups ended up leaving the building at the same time, and the adults made polite conversation about their enjoyment of the museum and the beautiful weather. "Beautiful day to be out with family," the man observed as they walked toward the parking area. "Perfect weather," Maria agreed. "We're visiting from out of town, so we're trying to take advantage of the sunshine." "San Diego's great for that," the man replied. "We live here, so we're lucky to have this kind of weather year-round." "Are you folks visiting for long?" Sarah let Maria handle most of the conversation, still trying to figure out why the man seemed so familiar. His voice, his manner of speaking, and his overall bearing all suggested someone she had encountered before, but the context remained elusive. As they reached the parking area and prepared to go their separate ways, the man extended his hand to Sarah. "It was nice talking with you back there about Afghanistan operations. Thank you for your service." "Thank you," Sarah replied, shaking his hand. "It was interesting hearing your perspective on special operations aviation. You obviously know the subject well." The man smiled modestly. "Just someone who's spent some time around helicopters and the people who fly them." The two families said their goodbyes and headed toward their respective cars. As they drove away from the museum, Sarah continued to puzzle over her sense of recognition. The man's knowledge, his bearing, and his obvious comfort discussing military operations all suggested someone with significant experience in special forces or elite military units. "Nice family," Maria observed as they drove home. "The dad seemed to know a lot about military stuff." "Did you recognize him from somewhere?" "I thought I did, but I can't place where I might have seen him before," Sarah replied. "He definitely has military experience, probably special operations from the way he talked about those helicopters." The boys chattered about their favorite parts of the museum visit, particularly the flight simulator and the space exploration exhibits. They were already making plans to return with their father, who shared their interest in aviation and space exploration. That evening, as they sat on Maria's back patio enjoying the mild California weather, Sarah found herself thinking about the day's events and the encounter at the museum. The combination of family time, beautiful weather, and interesting conversations had made it one of the most enjoyable days she had experienced in months. "You seem more relaxed than I've seen you in a long time," Maria observed as they watched her sons playing in the backyard while David prepared dinner on the barbecue grill. "I feel more relaxed," Sarah admitted. "Being here with you and the boys, getting away from hospitals and medical appointments, it's exactly what I needed. And that museum was really interesting today." I'm glad we decided to go. The boys loved it, and it seemed like you enjoyed the aviation exhibits. Sarah nodded, still thinking about the knowledgeable stranger who had made the helicopter presentation so interesting and informative. Something about the encounter continued to nag at her, a feeling that there was more to the story than a chance meeting with a fellow aviation enthusiast. As the evening wound down and the family prepared for bed, Sarah felt grateful for the simple pleasures of family time and the healing power of love and support from people who cared about her. The day had reminded her that recovery wasn't just about medical treatment and physical therapy, but also about reconnecting with the things and people that made life meaningful and worthwhile. She had no way of knowing that her path would cross again with the mysterious man from the museum, or that their next encounter would reveal his true identity and create a moment that would remind her of the bonds that connected all those who had served their country in uniform. For now, she was simply content to be surrounded by family and to feel, for the first time in months, that she was truly beginning to heal from the wounds of war. The rest of Sarah's visit with her sister's family passed quickly and peacefully. She spent time helping with homework, playing games with her nephews, and simply enjoying the rhythm of normal family life. By Sunday morning, however, it was time to prepare for her return trip to Boston, where she would continue her medical treatment and rehabilitation program. Maria insisted on driving Sarah to the airport early to avoid any potential traffic delays or complications with the check-in process. The boys wanted to come along to say goodbye, so the entire family made the trip to San Diego International Airport on Sunday afternoon. Sarah felt both grateful for the wonderful visit and somewhat sad to be leaving the warmth and comfort of her sister's home. The airport was busy with Sunday travelers, and the check-in process took longer than expected due to crowds of passengers returning from weekend trips or starting new business travel weeks. Sarah's flight to Boston wasn't scheduled to depart until late afternoon, but Maria wanted to make sure there was plenty of time for any unexpected delays or complications. After checking her bag and obtaining her boarding pass, Sarah said goodbye to her family at the security checkpoint. The boys gave her enthusiastic hugs and made her promise to visit again soon, while Maria fought back tears as she embraced her sister and wished her safe travels. David reminded Sarah that she was always welcome in their home and encouraged her to come back whenever she needed a break from her medical routine. The security line moved efficiently, and soon Sarah was through the checkpoint and heading toward her departure gate. She had about 2 hours before her flight, so she decided to find a quiet place to sit and perhaps get some coffee before the long journey back to Boston. Her gate was located in a busy section of the terminal, with restaurants, shops, and seating areas serving multiple departure gates. Sarah found a seat with a good view of the departure board and settled in to wait for her flight. She pulled out her phone to let Maria know she had made it through security successfully and to thank her again for the wonderful visit. As she was typing her text message, Sarah became aware of some commotion near one of the adjacent gates. Passengers were gathering and pointing towards something or someone, and there seemed to be more activity than usual for a typical Sunday afternoon departure. Security personnel and what appeared to be airline officials were moving through the area, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. Sarah looked up from her phone to see what was causing the excitement and immediately recognized several familiar faces from her flight earlier in the week. The two businessmen who had caused the scene in Chicago were standing near the gate counter, along with several other passengers she remembered from the delayed flight. It appeared that many of them were taking the same return flight to Boston. As more passengers gathered in the gate area, Sarah noticed that the same mysterious man from the museum was also present, though he was sitting quietly by himself near the windows overlooking the tarmac. He was dressed casually in jeans and a collared shirt, carrying the same simple black travel bag she had seen on the previous flight. The boarding process began on schedule, with airline staff calling for passengers in various priority groups. Sarah watched as the familiar faces from her earlier flight lined up according to their assigned zones. The two businessmen were among the first to board, having learned their lesson about creating scenes and apparently securing priority seating for the return trip. As Sarah waited for her zone to be called, she continued to observe the man from the museum. He remained seated while other passengers boarded, apparently waiting for his group to be announced. There was still something familiar about him that she couldn't quite identify, and she found herself hoping she might have another opportunity to speak with him during the flight. When her boarding zone was finally called, Sarah gathered her carry-on bag and joined the line of passengers waiting to board the aircraft. The line moved slowly, as is typical with Sunday evening flights full of tired travelers returning from weekend trips. As she waited, Sarah could see that the man from the museum was now standing in line several positions ahead of her. The aircraft was the same type she had flown on earlier in the week, and Sarah was assigned to a similar seat in the main cabin. As she made her way down the aisle looking for her row, she noticed that the mysterious passenger was seated in the business class section, in what appeared to be the same general area where he had sat on the previous flight. Sarah found her assigned seat and was pleased to discover that the middle seat next to her was unoccupied. The window seat was taken by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Eleanor and explained that she was returning to Boston after visiting her grandchildren in San Diego. Eleanor seemed friendly but tired, and Sarah suspected she would probably sleep for most of the flight. As the boarding process continued, Sarah could hear conversations from other passengers who had been on the delayed flight earlier in the week. Many of them recognized each other and were sharing stories about their experiences in San Diego or comparing notes about their travel plans. The atmosphere was much more relaxed than it had been during the stressful delays in Chicago. The two businessmen who had caused the earlier scene were seated several rows ahead of Sarah, and she could occasionally hear fragments of their conversations about meetings and business deals. They seemed to have returned to their normal self-important demeanor, apparently having forgotten the lessons about courtesy and patience they had received from other passengers during the delay. As the aircraft prepared for departure, Sarah noticed increased activity in the business class section. Flight attendants were having what appeared to be a serious conversation with the mysterious passenger, and other travelers were beginning to take notice of whatever was happening in the front of the plane. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-flight announcements, but Sarah could see that something unusual was happening in the business class area. Passengers were standing up to get a better view, and there was a general sense of curiosity and excitement throughout the cabin. About 10 minutes before the scheduled departure time, one of the flight attendants approached the mysterious passenger and appeared to be having an extended conversation with him. Sarah couldn't hear what was being said, but the body language suggested that this was something more significant than a routine passenger service interaction. Suddenly, one of the flight attendants picked up the intercom microphone and cleared her throat to get the attention of all passengers. The cabin, which had been filled with the usual pre-flight chatter and preparation, became quiet as everyone focused on the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our departure preparations, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone very special who is traveling with us today, the flight attendant began. We have the honor of having Commander James Mitchell with us, a U.S. Navy SEAL who recently returned from a classified mission overseas. The cabin erupted in applause, and passengers began standing up to show their respect and appreciation. Sarah felt a surge of recognition as she heard the name and, suddenly, realized why the man had seemed so familiar. She had seen his photograph in military publications and news articles about special operations missions and decorated service members. Commander Mitchell stood up briefly and acknowledged the applause with a modest wave, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but gracious in accepting the recognition from his fellow passengers. Sarah could see that he was wearing what appeared to be his military identification tags under his civilian shirt, and his bearing and demeanor suddenly made complete sense in the context of his identity and service record. As the applause continued, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was honored to be sharing the flight with such a distinguished service member, but she also felt a deep sense of connection to someone who had clearly made significant sacrifices in service to their country. The recognition being shown by the other passengers reminded her of the respect and gratitude that military service could inspire in civilian communities. One of the businessmen who had caused the scene during the earlier flight delay stood up and began walking toward the business class section. Sarah wondered if he was going to cause another disruption, but instead he approached Commander Mitchell with an expression of respect and humility that was completely different from his previous behavior. "Commander, I want to personally thank you for your service," the businessman said in a voice that carried throughout the cabin. "I know I was out of line during our last flight, and seeing someone like you reminds me of what real sacrifice and service look like." Commander Mitchell shook the man's hand and spoke quietly with him for a moment. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see that the interaction was respectful and genuine. The businessman returned to his seat with a noticeably different demeanor, apparently having gained some perspective about what truly mattered in life. Other passengers began approaching Commander Mitchell to express their gratitude and respect. Veterans identified themselves and shared brief stories about their own service, while civilian passengers simply wanted to shake his hand and say thank you. Sarah watched these interactions with growing emotion, remembering her own experiences with recognition and gratitude from civilian communities. As the line of passengers wanting to meet Commander Mitchell grew longer, Sarah found herself debating whether to join them. She felt a strong desire to connect with a fellow service member who had clearly distinguished himself in ways that she was only beginning to understand. At the same time, she was hesitant to draw attention to her own service and disabilities in such a public setting. The decision was made for her when Eleanor, the elderly woman in the window seat, gently touched her arm and pointed toward the purple heart pin on Sarah's jacket. "You should go up there, dear," Eleanor said softly. "You have as much right as anyone to speak with him, and I think he would appreciate meeting you." Sarah looked down at her purple heart pin and thought about her own service and sacrifices. She had never sought recognition or special treatment because of her injuries, but this felt different. This was about connecting with someone who understood the unique experiences and challenges of military service, especially in combat situations. With Eleanor's encouragement, Sarah stood up carefully and made her way toward the business class section. The line of passengers waiting to meet Commander Mitchell was moving slowly, with each person taking time to express their gratitude and appreciation. Sarah joined the line, feeling both nervous and excited about the opportunity to meet such a distinguished service member. As she waited, Sarah could hear fragments of conversations between Commander Mitchell and other passengers. He was gracious and humble, deflecting praise and instead talking about the importance of teamwork and the sacrifices made by all service members. His responses revealed someone who was clearly uncomfortable with individual recognition but deeply committed to honoring the broader military community. When Sarah's turn finally came, she approached Commander Mitchell with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. He looked up at her with the same alert, observant expression she had noticed at the museum, and his eyes immediately went to the purple heart pin on her jacket. "Army?" he asked with a knowing smile, extending his hand in greeting. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, Army Corps of Engineers. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan." Commander Mitchell's expression became more serious as he shook her hand. "Purple Heart," he observed, looking at her pin with obvious respect. "Combat injury?" "IED explosion in Kandahar province," Sarah replied simply. "Lost my left leg below the knee, but I was one of the lucky ones. My team made it home." Commander Mitchell's grip on her hand tightened slightly, and Sarah could see genuine emotion in his eyes. "There are no lucky ones when it comes to combat injuries," he said quietly. "There are only survivors who find the strength to keep moving forward. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice." The simple acknowledgement from someone who clearly understood the realities of combat and military service meant more to Sarah than all the medical treatments and rehabilitation programs she had endured. This was recognition from a peer, someone who had faced similar dangers and made similar sacrifices in service to their country. "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "And thank you for your continued service. People like you make it possible for the rest of us to believe that our sacrifices meant something." Commander Mitchell stood up and, in a gesture that surprised everyone in the immediate area, came to attention and rendered a sharp military salute to Sarah. The business class section fell silent as other passengers realized they were witnessing something significant and meaningful. Sarah, despite her civilian clothes and the limitations imposed by her prosthetic leg, instinctively came to attention and returned the salute with the precision and pride that had been drilled into her during her years of service. For a moment, the aircraft cabin disappeared, and there were only 2 warriors acknowledging each other's service and sacrifice. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but its impact reverberated throughout the aircraft. Other passengers, including the businessmen who had been so difficult during the previous, many had tears in their eyes as they witnessed this display of mutual respect between 2 people who had served their country in combat. As Sarah and Commander Mitchell relaxed from their salute, the applause grew louder and more sustained. Passengers throughout the cabin were standing and showing their appreciation for both service members, creating an atmosphere of patriotism and gratitude that transcended the usual boundaries of commercial air travel. Eleanor, the elderly woman who had encouraged Sarah to approach Commander Mitchell, was among those applauding most enthusiastically. When Sarah returned to her seat, Eleanor reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "That was beautiful, dear," Eleanor said with tears in her eyes. "My husband was a World War II veteran, and he would have been so proud to see that exchange between you two." As the aircraft prepared for departure, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion and healing. The recognition from Commander Mitchell and the respect shown by her fellow passengers had reminded her that her service and sacrifices were valued and appreciated by people who understood their significance. The flight to Boston proceeded smoothly, and Sarah spent much of the journey reflecting on the events of the past week. Her visit with her sister's family had provided the rest and emotional support she needed, while the encounter with Commander Mitchell had given her a renewed sense of pride in her military service and a reminder of the bonds that connected all those who had worn the uniform. When the plane landed in Boston, Commander Mitchell made a point of stopping by Sarah's seat to say goodbye. "Keep moving forward, Staff Sergeant," he said quietly. "Your service continues to matter, and your example continues to inspire others." As Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the aircraft, she felt stronger and more confident than she had in months. The combination of family support, public recognition, and peer acknowledgement had reminded her that healing was about more than just physical recovery. It was also about reconnecting with the values and relationships that gave life meaning and purpose. The journey home had become something much more significant than a simple trip to visit family. It had become a reminder of who she was, what she had accomplished, and how much her service continued to matter to others. As she walked through the terminal toward the baggage claim area, Sarah carried herself with the pride and dignity befitting a decorated veteran who had served her country with honor and distinction.